I'm Branko Milanovic, and I would be talking today about income inequality in the work of older authors. I start with Quesnay, then continue with Adam Smith and Ricardo. As you can see here in the title, Marx is also included there, but I think I would like to stop after about 1 hour, and I think I would leave Marx and Pareto, I think, for the next time. So there will be hopefully 2 different lectures. They are lectures for the general audience. They are also lectures for my own class, and it's something that I have not done before, nor I do think that anybody has done before, because the objective here would be to actually look at how classical writers from Quesnay to Marx have actually discussed inequality and how what they have discussed can be translated in the terms of interpersonal inequality. Because as this graph here shows you, they have actually discussed inequality in what is today called the functional income distribution. In other words, they have discussed inequality between capital, labor, and land, or if you prefer, between capitalists, workers, and landlords. So that was not a discussion of what we call today interpersonal inequality, where we actually look at all individuals or all households and simply line them up from the poorest to the richest and then calculate different indexes of inequality. They have not been doing that. And I would actually try to explain why I think they have not been doing that and why it was not a way that they were conceiving of inequality. Now, on this diagram, I've actually tried to put all the important people who have studied inequality in a same framework, with actually you can see the years are actually the years of their life, the birth and death, and they are of course lined up more or less according to the, the time when they have lived. And the big blue dots are the time where the most important work that they have done has been published. Obviously that's a matter of sort of some disagreement. I put, for example, for Adam Smith, I put Wealth of Nations as for the blue dot, but obviously some people might put Theory of Moral Sentiments, or so obviously there could be some differences there. Now, the first 3 authors who are here, Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, and also Quesnay, who is not on this slide, but with whom I will speak today, discussed income distribution, as I said before, in terms of functional income distribution. I think the main reason why they did it that way was of the implicit assumption that the classes that they had in mind have been lined up from the richest to the poorest. In other words, landlords were considered the richest. So if you essentially look at the functional income distribution, and in that functional income distribution, the type of income that you receive determines where you are in the distribution. You don't really need to spend too much time discussing the entire distribution because it's subsumed under this factoral income distribution. So landlords the richest, capitalists the second, and workers the poorest. And actually, in most cases, the assumption was that workers are either at a subsistence or some kind of a social subsistence. I will talk about that a little bit longer later, because obviously the wages at that stage were above the physiological subsistence, but the assumption was really that the wages would always remain at very low level, so that there was not much of a debate about the fact that the workers would remain in the bottom and that they would actually have a fairly low, as I call it, actually basically social subsistence level. Now, the type of income inequality that we study, and actually that's when I normally start my class, is interpersonal income distribution that was really introduced by Pareto. Since it's not the topic of my talk today, I will not say anything about why Pareto actually came up with this idea and how also the particular form into which he got the data led him to conclusions that actually were not true later. We found out that it was not exactly the way that Pareto had in mind, but on the other hand, Pareto made some very significant contributions including the definition of the Pareto law and the distribution function that we're still using today. Then we come to a next period. So Pareto, of course, was at the turn of the last century. So that was done in the 1890s, 1910. You see, of course, the years for Smith, Ricardo, and Marx here that they spent 18 and 19th century. Then we come to the period of the early 20th century, basically, where you have methodological contributions to study of inequality. I singled out here Dalton and Gini, but we don't have any theories. We basically have methodological contributions in the way like how to study inequality, what would be the measurement, is the study of inequality really the study of not the inequality in income, but inequality in utilities, as Dalton believed, or is it what was then came to be called the Italian view, which believed, and Gini was one of the proponents of that view, that the study of inequality is really study of incomes in the same way that we can study inequality in heights or weights. In other words, we don't have to have an underlying theory of welfare or of labor or what of utility, or what Pareto called of familiarity. So then we come to people like Quesnay and Tinbergen that actually did have theories of change of income distribution. Of course, Quesnay is still very much with us. Actually, that was probably the first formulation of a change in income distribution over a period of time, but over structural change that happens to an economy. So before Quesnay, we didn't have actually any view about how the structural change affects inequality between individuals. We had in Marx and Ricardo how structural change affects functional income distribution between capitalists and workers, but not between individuals. The next two authors are, I put Atkinson here, who has of course contributed a lot to the work on income distribution, but his contribution was of course wide and covered many countries and many periods, but was empirical. In other words, I'm not saying that empirical is not important, it's just that it was empirical without introduction of politics. So for example, when you read work that Atkinson did on the UK, which is extremely detailed, it takes place in some kind of a vacuum because you really don't have any discussion of what happened politically to lead to such changes. Well, this is different with Piketty, and that's why I called it empirics with politics, because Piketty in his original work on France, and of course in his famous Capital of the 21st Century, actually combines political developments with empirical developments in inequality. So it is providing, I think, a richer basis on which to look at inequality. So the first author that we are going to look is Quesnay. So Quesnay, as you can see here, actually covered 3/4 of the 18th century, and he was a doctor. He was not an economist because even the term of economist did not exist in those days. Actually, it was him and his a group of people that called themselves les économistes. So that actually, that was the introduction of the term that we are now using. So for the background, I want to just kind of show you a little bit like how, what we know and how France looked in terms of income distribution or income level in the second half of the 18th century. So here we are basically talking about the French society prior to the revolution. That's actually quite interesting because it gives us also an insight into how the society looked before the revolution, and indirectly you can say it actually gives us an insight into what propelled revolution to actually occur in France. So first of all, from the various works, which I am not going to quote and go into the details, actually you can see the sources even on the graph, we actually have calculations of the French Gini coefficient, which is a measure of inequality, that was about 50 or up to 55. Now, 55 is pretty high level of inequality, which nowadays we find only in Latin American countries. So there are no really rich country which has a Gini coefficient which is about 50 or 55. The United States, which is an outlier among the rich countries, has a Gini which is above 40. So we are talking really about pretty high inequality. Moreover, it was an inequality that was higher than inequality in England. And of course, I would mention that when I discuss the background to UK or to England and Scotland in the discussion of Adam Smith. So essentially, French inequality was higher than English inequality. On the other hand, the French mean income was significantly lower than the English mean income. As you can see here, the numbers for the French mean income range between 3.3 and 3.8 times the subsistence. The subsistence is generally put at what we would put also today at the absolute poverty line of about $400 per year per person. So, you know, it was a relatively low income level, not compared to other countries, for example, in Europe that were even lower, but certainly compared to England. And the English income level at that time, as you can see from the slide, was about 6 times. So the bottom line, France was fairly unequal country and less developed or less rich than England. So here is actually 2 nice quotes, one from Chateaubriand, who is of course famous French writer, but he lived in exile in England. So here is a quote from him in his book, which is called Mémoires d'Outre-Tombe, where he sort of describes his surprise by poverty of France when he came back from England. You can read this. He says, on the road, one could hardly see any man, only women draped in black and dark skin, barefoot with no headgear, and one could almost mistake them for slaves. The famous travelogue of Arthur Young, who actually traveled through France and left an enormous book about his impressions, and that happened just years before the revolution, tells more or less the same story, but here in the quote that I chose is the contrast is drawn between the wealth of the noblemen, of the French aristocracy, the chateaus that of course we can still see today, and the poverty of people. So these are, as I said, 2 contemporary rendition of that large inequality which existed in France. I put here as an interesting aside that only about, half a century later, or even less, Tocqueville would actually now travel to England to investigate why is poverty in England so abysmal and extreme, despite the fact that England was more developed than France. So actually, this is an interesting thing here that in a span of 50 years, the extreme poverty, I think, between France and England changed. In other words, the Industrial Revolution in England, of course, increased the incomes on average, but actually made poor people much poorer than they used to be. So when Tocqueville went to England, he was, as I said, he was intrigued, and actually he was sent specifically by Academy of Sciences to look at why the English have such horrible poverty, which didn't exist in France, partly because France was still a fairly peasant society where at least people had enough to eat. But in the case of England, you even had actually problems of starvation or lack of food or insufficient food or so on. So now from Quesnay and les économistes, or as they were called later, physiocrats, because of their emphasis on the wealth creating potential of agriculture, France was perceived correctly as an agricultural kingdom. So what was their objective? When they created this movement of physiocrats, which was sometimes likened to a sort of a cabal or caste, actually. That's how Adam Smith called them, a caste. Their objective was actually to influence economic policy. Their objective was not to create an economic science, although they would insist that they are actually taking a scientific approach to what they're doing. But their objective was to affect economic policy. Their primary objective was to have France adopt what they called, and actually that was the term that they have coined, laissez-faire and laissez-passer. Laissez-passer means abolish internal customs, and laissez-faire means let people do whatever they want in terms of production, let not the state impose and tell them what they should be doing. So these are the two terms, as I said, which are still with us, and they were in favor of the free trade of grain within the kingdom, which was very important because, of course, there were internal impediments to trade, but they are externally still mercantilistic. So the mercantilistic part, which then Adam Smith would criticize, was still present at that early stage of development of economics, and economics as a science. They also believed, which is very important for our discussion of inequality, that the wealth of poorer classes is an indication of the wealth of the country. I cannot stress strongly enough how important it is, because it is only when you start believing that the wealth of the poorer classes are an indication of the wealth of the country that you start actually caring about the wealth or income of the poorer classes, and you actually conceive of an idea of an income distribution. So long as, for example, mercantilists and others did not really think about wealth of the country as being related to the wealth of laborers or poor people, but really related to the wealth of the king, to the amount of the treasury that you have, ability to extract income or wealth from other parts of the world, then you really were not at all interested nor concerned about what is happening to the lower classes. It was totally immaterial for you. And this is an important change which comes with physiocrats, and as I will show later, with also Adam Smith continued with. They also were very much influenced by China. That's quite interesting because the knowledge of China in Europe at that time was not particularly great. Still, what people knew was that China was a large agricultural kingdom, that it had lots of people, I think about 300 million in those days, and that it was ruled by a benevolent monarchy, which was precisely what Quesnay and Mirabeau and others from the physiocratic group wanted to have in France. They wanted to have a benevolent monarch. And they also knew that China was ruled by a body of noble scholars. As you know, there is a famous Chinese exam for scholars, which existed for several thousand years with some interruptions. And physiocrats saw themselves in that role. So in other words, their idea was, let's have a more progressive agricultural kingdom that would care about the wealth of the poorer classes. Let's have obviously a kingdom with a benevolent king, and we basically us who are going to tell the king and the kingdom how to organize the economic sphere, economic life, and what type of policy to follow. So now we come to really something which really concerns us now, which really deals now with income inequality, is the first definition of several social classes and several types of income. So that's an absolutely crucial change in the perception of inequality and in the perception of society, which comes with Quesnay. So you have first workers who receive wages. You have tenant farmers who receive management compensation, and also they receive interest on the capital which they have invested in farming. And then you have three other classes which receive what they call the net product or the surplus, and I will come to that in a minute. And that surplus is received by landlords who receive rents, by government administration that receives taxes, and by the clergy that receives cites or income, for clergy, also from the surplus. So what you really have here for the first time is the definition, as you can see, of 5 classes. So workers, tenant farmers, landlords, administration, and clergy. And very clear definition of types of income that they receive. As you notice here, is that there is some similarity with French official nomenclature of the time, which actually had three classes: clergy, aristocracy, and the rest, which is people, or what we call tiers état, which eventually then would create a revolution. But where, as you can see in that tiers état, we have peasants, we have workers, we have bourgeoisie. They are still part of the tiers état because they are neither clergy nor aristocracy. We also have in Quesnay and physiocrats another extremely important development, and that's the creation of the idea of the surplus. So surplus, they believed, was only available in agriculture. So their view was essentially that you cultivate the land. The land is, of course, fertile. It provides a compensation for workers who work on that land, which means farmers. It provides compensation for the tenant farmer, the person who has organized the production and invested capital, which you need to start tilling the land. And most importantly, it produces a surplus. Now that surplus is being, as I've already said before, being distributed and received by the three classes: by landlords, by government officials, and by the clergy. But the idea, the key idea here is suddenly the economic life is producing a surplus. And of course, that was an idea that would be very dear and would actually have Marxists and Marx himself be very indebted to Quesnay. Actually, if you read Marx's notes, he has almost, I think, about 100 pages on Quesnay. And mostly because of Quesnay's identification of a net product, of a surplus that really belongs to people who, as you can see here, really don't work. These are people who either are like landlords, they simply own land, or government administration that actually is not directly engaged in the production process. And finally, clergy, which obviously is not really doing any actual work. So this was the second important contribution that Quesnay and physiocrats did. And the third one, on which I will not speak, is the idea that the economy is a circular flow, so that basically the process of production repeats itself. And to some extent, of course, they were driven by that, by the idea of agriculture, which is, of course, a process which repeats itself at regular annual intervals. And here is, for example, a book that, this is one of the books with, several number of physiocratic authors, including Quesnay, and which has the very famous Le Tableau Économique, which shows the flow, the circular flow that comes in the economic life, which is actually very difficult to often figure out, because this is, of course, many of these zigzagging lines that show you what is kind of happening, and with lots of numerical examples. And some of these numerical examples turned out later to have been actually wrong. There were mistakes in simple calculations. So it has really kept, hundreds of people busy for 200 years to figure this out. Now, let's go further to the social classes. Workers, their wages are in subsistence. So the workers here really are peasants or farmers. Then property owners or tenant farmers are all supposed to get the same return on their income. They get 10%, and the main source of inequality is here that different tenants or property owners might have different amounts of capital. So that we enter, as you can see now, already in something which looks like income distribution. Workers at the lowest level, they have subsistence wages. Then you have tenant farmers that own different amounts of capital. They all receive, for simplicity, the same percentage return, but since they have different amounts of capital, their incomes would differ. So it's a very rudimentary structure even within agriculture, but it's even more rudimentary outside of agriculture, simply because given the level of development then, Quesnay and Mirabeau and others did not really pay that much attention to manufacturing and to anything which was outside of agriculture. So what is happening outside of agriculture, you have self-employed workers, non-agricultural self-employed workers who own their own capital and combine that with their own labor to generate wages for themselves. Now, these people do not generate any surplus for anybody. That's quite important because that was the basis on which they actually argued that, that activities outside of agriculture, like manufacturing, were sterile. So in other words, they were sterile because they were not generating surplus. It is important to realize that they were never sterile in the sense of not generating income for workers who were working in manufacturing. They generated wages for them. They also generated return on the capital which they owned. But they did not, according to Quesnay, generate surplus for the three other classes that, as the previous slide said, he called propriétaires, which were clergy, landlords, and government administration. So these three classes really get their incomes only from the surplus from agriculture. So outside of agriculture, there are no residual claimants, or the manufacturing system is not rich enough to create such a surplus. So the propriétaire, which means these three classes that receive the surplus, play the same role in Quesnay as we shall see later as capitalist does in Ricardo. They are all residual claimants. So they are receiving something after the workers have received the wage and after capitalists have received the return on the amount of capital which they have invested in land. So it's only after that that the residual claimants, which means in this case, les propriétaires, come to play. So they receive the surplus. But their income or that surplus is absolutely indispensable for the economy to grow. In other words, for the economy to remain functioning and to grow, you need to have a surplus, and that surplus has to be received by a residual claimant. And it's only in function of the importance of that surplus that you would have the economy grow. If there is no surplus, you would not have growing economy. So this is something which of course will become even more strongly emphasized in Ricardo, but you can already see here the connection between the view of the world that Quesnay had and later Ricardo. So how does it look in, when you put Quesnay's numbers? This is actually from a paper that I did on Quesnay several years ago. You basically, I will not go into all of that. You can see actually the classes on your left, workers, tenant farmers, landlords, government administration, and clergy. And you see the three types of factoral incomes or functional income distribution: labor, capital, and land, and taxes. And what is the distribution that comes out of Quesnay's Tableau économique, and actually another work, which is La philosophie rurale that I mentioned here. Labor gets more than a half of total output, capital gets 20%, and land and taxes get the remaining 30% approximately. So this is not very much, how should I say, different from what we might expect to have happened actually in France at the time. So these were done, these numbers that Quesnay put together were sort of generally considered numbers that are rather representative of what France should look like. But there was a very strong, I think, element of what actually Quesnay believed France was at the time when he was writing. So they are not simply representative of an ideal. I think they are representative also of the actual conditions that existed in France. And then this is a kind of more complicated table, so I will actually, you can skip all these other columns except the last one. Look at the column which says average remuneration. Now that column is important for us because it establishes the ranking, the pecking order of social classes. As you can see, agricultural wages, which means workers in agriculture or farmers, are the lowest class. They receive on average 455 francs per year. Then you have non-agricultural wages. These are the people that I mentioned before that are working in the manufacturing sector, they are already better paid, so significantly higher wage for them. And then you have tenant farmers that receive the management fee and interest on their capital. As you notice, they're about 5 times as well off as agricultural workers or peasants. And then finally, they receive 2,700 francs on average. And then finally, the 3 classes of propriétaires who receive about 2,000 francs each. He doesn't distinguish between the incomes of landlords, government administration, and clergy. They are all assumed to have the same average income. So you have seen here, essentially, the class structure of society, and the class structure, not simply that we have different classes and we call them differently, but they are also ranked by their income. And that's the first time that we have in economics a distribution like that. And as you can still see, is distribution that is still essentially dominated by the type of labor or position in society that you really have. There is not really interpersonal inequality within workers or within, capitalists, but we are sort of slowly approaching that position. So we are still doing factorial income distribution. So how does it then move to Adam Smith? And of course, this is a huge topic that has been studied, for 200 years. So what is important is actually just to remind ourselves about the social structure in England around the time of Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. As you can see, the year here is 1776. It actually happened by accident to be also the year of the American independence. And for those who actually might have forgotten that, the very ending of the Wealth of Nations discusses the American independence movement and the position of British Empire, and of course ends with that sort of melancholic point that Smith makes, that actually England, or United Kingdom, actually England and Scotland, should reconcile themselves to the mediocrity of their position in the future if they were to lose colonies in North America. So how did the class structure look in England at the time when Adam Smith is writing his book? I'm now speaking of England simply because it's simpler to speak of England, but of course we all know that Adam Smith is, Scottish, that actually his experience was the experience of Scotland and the experience of Scottish fairly good performance or increase of incomes during his lifetime. But since England is, of course, a topic of his discussion of England and Scotland, I would, of course, mostly use England as an example, and simply we have more data on England than on Scotland. So here is a social table that was done by Massey, and that was reworked recently by Bob Allen. And this is the class structure of England and Wales in 1759. So not really what we're talking about 17 years before the publication of the Wealth of Nations. So look at the sizes of these different social classes. The biggest social class are obviously workers that are 56% of the whole population, then farmers another 20% almost. So basically between workers and farmers, you have something like 80% of the population. Then you have another 10%, which are very poor people, paupers and cottagers. So then you really end up with 90% of people who are either workers, farmers, or paupers. And then what remains, it's almost another percent who are shopkeepers and small traders. And what remains, actually, because I've been rounding off the numbers, but what remains is about 4% of capitalists and just 1.5% of landed aristocracy. So as you can see here, we have almost, almost an inverted correlation between the size of a group in terms of number of people and income of a group. As you can imagine, as I will also show you, landed aristocracy was the smallest group, but they were the richest. capitalists were the second smallest group, but they were the second richest. And then shopkeepers were the third one by low size, but they were better off than the farmers and workers. So we have really a very interesting situation in very class-based societies where your class position determines your income, and the more numerous your class, the lower your income. Obviously, the only exception to that are paupers. They were not 80% of the people, but they were 10%. These are, of course, the poorest class in England. So let's now see how the average income of these classes has moved over the period from 1700 to actually all the way to Marx in the end 1870. So this is also based on social tables. As I said before, it was the one that was before based on Massey's social table, but here we have a succession of social tables done by different contemporary British authors. Gregory King from 1688, you can read actually the names here, Massey, Colquhoun, 1801. I use, for example, that social table in a work that I did on, for example, locating Pride and Prejudice in the position of Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy in the income distribution, because this table from 1801 really coincides very closely with the time of Pride and Prejudice. Then the other two tables are by Smee and Baxter, ends in 1867. This was done based on a paper from 2017 by Bob Allen, who has taken these tables. They've been taken also by other authors, for example, by Peter Lindert, and sort of refashioned a little bit to create a sort of a same structure, same class composition over time. Now look at here, I singled out aristocracy, capitalists, and workers. That comes from, as I said, from Bob Allen's reworking of social tables. Now, as you can see, workers obviously are the poorest, capitalists are number 2, and aristocracy is number 1. We have seen that before. The gaps are actually much larger than they appear on this graph, because this is, the scale is in log terms. Otherwise, if it was not in log terms, you would actually have a graph that would have really workers very much on the bottom. You would not even see their incomes. So much is the difference between these three classes. You do notice that workers for a long time are about the same level. And then we'll talk about later about that with Ricardo and more with Marx. There is an increase in wages and the average income of workers. On the other hand, capitalists, as you notice here, at the time of Adam Smith, have actually a very significant increase of income, and they're starting to catch up with aristocracy. They're still not at the same level, but it's important to realize that when Smith and Ricardo were writing their books, capitalists were really catching up, and they have sort of, they were becoming a class that was almost of equal wealth as aristocracy. Now, this was not the case in what we saw about Quesnay before. What we saw there, we saw really a more a traditional society where these top classes are actually still the dominant classes in terms of income. But in the case of England and Scotland, we see this change, or what you would call a development. Now, how does inequality look like in England then? These are three different works which use all of them social tables. Bob Allen, Steve Broadberry with several co-authors, and MLW, that's me, Lindert, and Jeffrey Williamson. And you can see we all come with slightly different numbers, but the basic story here is increase of inequality at the time and 1800s, and at the end actually of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, again at the time when Smith was actually writing or thinking about the wealth of nations, or also before thinking about and writing about the theory of moral sentiments. So the bottom line, we have structural transformation of England, whereby capitalism becomes much more prevalent. We have catching up of incomes by capitalists in the sense that they have become, they're in the process of becoming richer and catching up with aristocracy. And we basically have stable incomes of workers, which means very low, and with no change. And we have a rising inequality. So rising incomes and rising inequality and social transformation were really, I think, the features that we can say were present in England at the time when Adam Smith was writing. So for all three authors, as I said before, the functional income distribution is basically synonymous with personal income distribution. I have already explained that. And there is a very clear income ranking, although that income ranking is in the process of being slightly readjusted in the relationship between the two important and richest classes, landowners and industrial capitalists. And implicitly, everybody who is in a higher class is richer than anyone who belongs to a lower class. So you can also imagine that in a distribution, so that if you are in a distribution in a poorer class, you might have some differences in income levels, but whoever is either the top worker would still have a lower income than the lowest capitalist. So in other words, there is no what is today called, there is no class overlap. In other words, the two classes or several classes never overlap. One class actually begins where the other class ends. So everybody from a lower class is poorer than anyone in the richer class. And of course, this is of course particularly relevant for workers because they are the lowest class and they basically by assumption are never richer than anybody from the other two classes, capitalist or landlord. So that's the reason why interpersonal income distribution is to some extent really subsumed into functional income distribution, as I was saying before, because simply there is no overlap. So why did Smith, Ricardo, and Marx not care, nor discuss much interpersonal income inequality? Because they were not perceiving interpersonal income inequality as something worth discussing. So obvious it was to them that your source of income and your position in a functional income distribution determines your income level. So they were implicitly saying, we are working on a functional income distribution, which is synonymous with interpersonal income distribution. So it's only later in development that we would come actually to study interpersonal income distribution because we would notice that that class structure becomes weakened. In other words, we would notice in the 19th century and then 20th century that there are some people who are laborers, some people who are workers whose main source of income is labor, but they could be better off than people who are self-employed or people who are actually having mostly capital income. So that would be a change in the structure of society that would lead us to also a change in the way that we explain society in terms of income distribution. Now, let me go on Adam Smith and how we can actually see Adam Smith in continuum with Quesnay. First, the Wealth of Nations comes only 13 years after La Philosophie Rurale, but it has an entirely different view of the economy. So we are talking now about something which we already recognize as a modern economy, where the industry or the manufacturing is at the center stage, no longer agriculture. Big change. There is the introduction of the tripartite class distribution. These are the three major classes that we still use today. As you remember, in Quesnay, there were 5 classes. Here, we're talking about 3 classes: owners of land, owners of capital, and owners of labor, so to speak. So this is the distribution that we still, as I said, use. Also, for Smith, the opulence of a country is undistinguishable from the good living standard, good conditions of the largest social group, workers. So here is the quote, from Adam Smith, that, the wage or the income of the price of labor is considered as an indicator of general opulence of society. So again, this is the point that I mentioned with Quesnay. Once you start thinking that good society or rich society is a society where majority of people live well or have high income, then your whole perception totally changes. So you move to what is more modern economics, and you leave behind that obsession, that concentration on power of the state, mercantilism, and the wealth of the king of the top classes. So this is really a major change, as we see here, and it's very clear throughout the wealth of nations, is that really the wealth or the good living conditions or reasonable living conditions of workers are really crucial. And they distinguish advanced societies from those that are actually stagnant or declining societies. Now, one thing that actually is important to mention, and that's obviously an issue which personal views are very much sort of, coloring that, is the difference between theory of moral sentiments and wealth of nations. So I'm not going to go through all of the things because this is again a topic that has been studied endlessly. So here is, for example, Wealth of Nations. You see, it's a pretty large book, It's in this particular edition has 1,200 pages. It is, about almost 400,000 words. And here is the theory of moral sentiments in this edition. That it has 300 pages. It's actually a shorter book, and it's a very different book. So let me go over some things which are relevant for us, meaning for income distribution. Theory of moral sentiments is, of course, a book written by Smith as a moral philosopher. It deals with relations between us and those who are close to us, family, friends, people whom we meet daily. It does not deal, as I would argue what the Wealth of Nations doesn't deal with our economic relations with strangers. So the focus of the two books are very different. One is us in relationship to our friends and family and people close to us. Another is our relationship with anonymous agents with whom we have to deal because we want to improve our own position and because we need to sell our labor or we need to invest our capital. So it's really entirely different focus. And that's what I argue is actually the two books are quite different. Now, very often TMS is really thought softer than the Wealth of Nations, partly because of Amartya Sen's reading of that. I think that it's actually wrong, and that in the matters of distribution, that theory of moral sentiments, it's much harder. And it's much harder because Smith in TMS basically wants you to accept an immutable class structure. So he would ridicule, as you can see, you will see that in a minute, he would make fun of the rich people, aristocracy, how frivolous they are, how they would actually waste their money, how their sort of way of life is wasteful. But he would never put in doubt the justness or of their income. So in other words, he would take the class structure as given and, like Veblen did, make fun of those at the top to some extent, or show them how they're really in many respects worthless. But he would never question their right to that income. Now, that would be very different in the Wealth of Nations, where I would show you a number of quotes where he actually questions very strongly whether these incomes really were right and whether these people who have these high incomes deserved. So you can see here, this is the quote from the TMS. That's the first mention of the invisible hand. But as you read this quote, it's an extremely harsh, I would say sort of reactionary quote, because what does it say? It says, look, the land has been distributed in a very unequal fashion, but because those who have lots of land are spending it so that they actually need to get other things, to, have servants, to have, all the other sort of accoutrement of wealth, Then eventually the providence has actually made it possible that other people, by providing these services to the landlords, also have their own sustenance. Well, it's very sort of, I would say, very strange statement. It's basically saying, I'm rich, I'm extremely rich, but because I'm spending money on you so that you provide services for me, I'm actually making your life sort of sustainable or sufferable. So as you can see, there is no questioning of my right to have so much more than you. And moreover, my profligacy or spending is really considered almost a sort of a way for me to help you, as he says, led by an invisible hand. So it is a very, very tough statement to make. Just to show you the difference, I think, in the perception and the audience that Smith has in TMS versus Wealth of Nation, look at this graph that I did only a few days ago. And I looked at the number of times that the words God, divine, and providence appear in TMS versus Wealth of Nations. Since TMS is written by a moral philosopher, and he was then also teaching religion, although Smith's own relation to religion is, of course, a big topic, and he still uses religion and providence a lot. So you have here in the theory of moral sentiments, God, divine, and providence are mentioned 86 times. Now, how many times are they mentioned in the Wealth of Nations? Practically not at all. 6 times. In a book which, in terms of number of words, is almost 3 times as long. So you basically have very different audience, very different idea, very different way of writing in the two books. And unlike many people who actually believe that because theory of moral sentiments is directed toward our relationship with others, somehow it is softer and milder. In reality, I think when it comes to the study of inequality, it is much harsher, as I said before, than the Wealth of Nations. So there in theory of moral sentiment, very clear theistic elements, and also they come also in the Wealth of Nations when he calls Mandeville's system pernicious system. And so actually this is the quote from the TMS when he calls Mandeville pernicious system. So TMS often, in my opinion, makes Smith look not only conservative, but outright reactionary, very similar to some most reactionary, Calvinist theologians. And by the way, Marx actually called Adam Smith the Luther of economics. Now, Smith was technically an Anglican. I say that his relationship to religion is, to say the least, unclear. He could have been even, atheistic. We really don't know. He was very close friend with Hume, and but he never really explicitly spoke of him being atheistic. However, in TMS, the poor should accept their position because it is a divine will, and that's how the societies are structured. But the rich are not virtuous. So as I said before, there is a critique of the rich, but it's not the critique of their position in the income distribution, nor of justice of the incomes which they received. Now, the Wealth of Nations is, and I agree with Stigler on that, was built on the granite of self-interest. So it's not built on altruism, nor on empathy. It's actually built on self-interest that we have. So even our cooperation with other people is always sort of being driven by our own self-interest. Indeed, for the Wealth of Nations to stand firm and tall, self-interest is enough. Moreover, Smith really displays a praiseworthy economy of assumptions. He doesn't need too many assumptions in the Wealth of Nations. Self-interest really is practically enough. It is much more realistic, as I said before. It questions the justice of incomes of the top classes. it has a different view of human nature. The people in the wealth of nation are people who follow their interests, and the top classes derived their incomes oftentimes, sometimes maybe you can argue most of the time, from monopoly, unjust deals, special privileges, swindles. So as you can see now, the justification of these high incomes is very often really non-existent. And that's why it is a much more, I think, critical book than Theory of Moral Sentiments. So let us go through some of these examples. The use of irony against the top income classes. First of all, the irony in general that not much good has known to be done by those who are affected to trade for public good. As Adam Smith says, it's an affectation, indeed not very common among merchants, and very few words need to be employed in dissuading them from it. This is his view of human nature, which I think is very different from the TMS. This is, of course, quotes from the Wealth of Nations. Or take this one, the late resolution of the Quakers in Pennsylvania to set at liberty all their Negro slaves may satisfy us that their number cannot be very great. There is hardly a more sort of ironic statement that can be made than this. So it is much more, Wealth of Nations is much more leftist on inequality than Theory of Moral Sentiments, precisely because it questions the justice of high income, does not accept the ethical validity of natural hierarchy. It does accept that there is a hierarchy because the hierarchy is driven by income levels, but it doesn't accept ethically that that's a hierarchy which is valid in the sense that the higher classes are morally or ethically superior to the lower classes. Moreover, it presents social classes in conflict over distribution of the net product. So that's again a very important departure from Theory of Moral Sentiments. So TMS, as I said before, ridicules spending patterns of the rich, but does not question their right to high incomes. The Wealth of Nation does that. So where does the income of the rich come from in the Wealth of Nation? It comes from oftentimes monopoly, price fixing, plunder. These are the famous statements that the people of the same trade seldom meet together, except for the conversation to end in a conspiracy against the public or some contrivance to raise prices. Now, he says it's impossible to prevent such meetings, but we can hinder the law, and the law cannot hinder people of the same trade from assembling together, but it ought to do nothing to facilitate such assemblies, much less to render them necessary. Now think of the Davos. What does Davos do? Davos does exactly what Adam Smith says should not be encouraged by authorities, by governments, or by anybody, because it is really a conspiracy against the public. Now, what do merchant companies do? East India, the English, and VOC, the Dutch merchant companies. He says it very clearly. The government of an exclusive company of merchants is perhaps the worst of all governments for any country whatsoever. So in other words, if countries are ruled by merchants, they would be ruled horribly, badly, and only in the interest of the merchants. Crusaders, the most destructive frenzy that ever befell the European nations. And who were the Crusaders spurred on? By the merchant republics of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, for whom the crusade was the source of opulence. So again, extremely sharp critique of merchants, merchant companies, power of merchants or of capitalists, and power of the rich people to basically conspire against the public. None of that would you ever find even closely in the theory of moral sentiments. The rich must not be allowed to rule the state. And there he actually mentions the difference between North America and the British India, because British India is ruled by the East India Company. And as we have just seen, as he says, it is the worst way of ruling a state. So the bottom line is that the rule by the rich is not in the social interest. And here you have that the rulers of mankind should not be merchants and manufacturers, and they should be corrected or prevented for disturbing the tranquility of anybody but themselves. So in other words, what Smith establishes or tries to establish here is what you might call later autonomy of the state. So in other words, that the state should not be ruled by capitalists or by the rich people, but that there should be an autonomy of the state which should pursue a public interest. And that public interest is not the same thing as the interest of capitalists or merchants. Another quote, capitalists are an order of men whose interest is never exactly the same as that of the public, who have generally an interest to deceive and even to oppress the public, and who accordingly have, upon many occasions, both deceived and oppressed. So, very clear statement that the government should not be what Marx later called, Marx and Engels actually called, the Committee for the Management of the Joint Affairs of the Bourgeoisie. So autonomy of the state, absolutely crucial for Smith, and that autonomy of the state means that the position of the rich people in influencing policy has to be questioned. So another quote is about the nobility and usurpation of, this is the quote about the entails, which are the control over the land, and the inheritance of the land, which was the exclusive privilege of the nobility. And again, Smith uses irony when he talks about that. So essentially, we have economic criticism of the rich, and whose power is considered deeply pernicious for the society and has to be kept in check. The main point of contrast with TMS and with other and later writers of economic harmonies is really the questioning of justice of high incomes. So anybody who would come with marginal productivity of capital and things like that would be basically dismissed by Smith. It's essentially the justice of high incomes it has to be questioned. Not always, because Smith implicitly has two versions of capitalism. One, which is competitive and where incomes are, broadly speaking, just. And another sort of crony capitalism, call it like that, where incomes are the product of swindle, monopoly, plunder. And he just sees the really existing capitalism as more of the latter. But there are, of course, the elements of the former, of the competitive capitalism as well. So the objective, I think, what would Smith see is a transformation from this really existing capitalism of monopoly and plunder, colonial exploitation, and so forth, into a much more competitive and equal capitalism where monopoly and plunder would play much more of a role. And there is a big difference between the toothless moral critique of the rich from the theory of moral sentiment, which now becomes a critique based on political economy. Now, these high incomes that Smith criticizes really detract from what he calls the natural progress of opulence, and that natural progress of opulence is made equivalent to tolerable or improving standard of living of the poor people. So let me then try to sort of wrap up Smith. So the realistic view of top classes' income is combined with the importance of welfare of lower classes. Advanced society, he says, cannot be a society where workers are badly paid. Another contrast that he makes is between Spain and Portugal, which exhibit high wealth of a small ruling class and poverty of others, versus the Netherlands, which is actually used in a number of examples in Wealth of Nations as a country with high wages and low rate of interest. So actually the Netherlands and to some extent England are positive examples because they combine high wages for workers and low rate of interest for capitalists. So this was an important, again, very important change compared to mercantilists and the others, where really it is the low rate of interest which is now seen to be the feature of an advanced or advancing or improving society. So the welfare of the majority of people becomes the criterion of judging how well the society is doing and what a good society means. How about the real wage? In Smith and Ricardo and Marx, as I was saying before, we really have to deal with something which you might call the relative subsistence. In other words, the assumption is that the wages are in a short run or medium run constant. They are not necessarily at the physiological subsistence, but they are at some level of subsistence which is sort of considered acceptable for the level of income of that country. That actually comes very clearly in the famous quotes that many people have used for Smith, where he says that under necessities, he comprehends not only things that are physiologically necessary to survival, but also the things that are needed by the established rules of decency, which basically means by the average income level of that society. So that actually introduces this relativistic element where the subsistence is not simply physiological subsistence. Subsistence is something which is acceptable for a given society. In other words, the minimal amounts of other comforts of life that are considered necessary for survival. So obviously Smith mentions the differences in real wages between the countries. You know, we will find exactly the same thing in Marx. Actually, he would actually give numerical examples how different countries have different income levels. And Smith, of course, says the advanced countries are those with higher wages and low rate of interest. As I mentioned before, the Netherlands and England come in that category. So here, what is interesting for us is that this country's growth rate is linked to the level of wages. So in other words, if the country, according to Smith, has a high growth rate, then it would also be a country with high level of wages. So this is essentially how real wages play a role in Smith. And the income distribution is then an income distribution which is still class-based, where the incomes of the top classes are considered with a huge amount of skepticism, and where the objective of social policy, which should not be dictated, as we have seen, by the interest of the wealthy, is improvement of the welfare of the poorest classes and improvement of real wages. So what we can say finally here, just to conclude on Smith, is that he sees an advanced society as a society where the welfare of the most dominant, numerically most dominant class, which were workers or peasants. We have seen that first graph, remember that first graph about social structure of England and Wales. That welfare is key. So inequality implicitly should be moderate, because only if inequality is moderate can we have a prosperous society, which means can we have prosperous, large, and prosperous working class. In that sense, as you can see, Smith is very much a modern author, even more so than Quesnay, although there are, I think, very clear continuities between the two. On the continuity part, let me just mention that, of course, Smith and Quesnay knew each other, because when Smith was traveling in Europe, tutoring, he spent lots of time in France and met Quesnay in Paris. And actually there is a reference to that also in the Wealth of Nations, but he does not discuss physiocrats much. I think it's basically dismissed in a few paragraphs, but they knew each other personally. So let me stop today here, and next time we should move to Ricardo, Marx, and eventually to Pareto.